The morning air was already heavy when the market began to wake. Wooden stalls creaked open one by one. Metal shutters rattled upward, and voices layered over each other in a familiar chorus of bargaining, laughter, and impatience. Buses hissed to a stop nearby. Motorcycles weaved through narrow paths. The city was alive and hungry. At the edge of the market, a young salesgirl unlocked her small stall. It was barely wide enough for her to stand comfortably. A wooden table, a few neatly arranged goods, nothing extra, nothing wasted. She moved with quiet efficiency, as if every motion had been practiced too many times to count. Her stomach tightened suddenly, sharp and loud enough that she paused. She pressed a hand lightly against her abdomen and exhaled through her nose. She hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. No dinner. No snack. Just water and sleep, if you could call it sleep. Still, she straightened her shoulders. Hunger was familiar. It didn't scare her anymore. From a small plastic bag beneath the table, she pulled out her only meal of the day. Simple food. Modest portions. Wrapped carefully, as though it were something precious. She set it aside, telling herself she would eat later after the first sale, after the market settled, after something changed. Around her, life moved quickly. Traders shouted prices. Customers pushed past one another. A woman laughed loudly as she counted her money. A man argued over change. No one noticed the salesgirl standing quietly behind her stall, guarding a meal that felt smaller with every passing second. Then the noise shifted. Not louder, softer. The sound of worn rubber scraping against the ground. She looked up. A crippled beggar stood a few steps away. His clothes were torn and faded beyond their original color. One leg was twisted unnaturally, forcing his weight onto old, uneven crutches. His shoulders sagged, not just from exhaustion, but from the invisible weight of being ignored too many times. People noticed him, and then, just as quickly, they didn't. Eyes turned away. Conversations continued. A trader pretended to rearrange items that were already neat. Another man took 2 steps sideways to create distance, as if poverty could rub off through the air. The beggar stopped in front of her stall. He didn't stretch out his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, breathing shallowly, waiting until she met his eyes. When he spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Please, I haven't eaten in 2 days." The words landed gently, but their weight was crushing. Her gaze dropped instantly to the food beside her. Her only meal. The thing she had been saving. The thin line between getting through the day and collapsing before sunset. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the table. 2 days. She imagined the dull ache of hunger turning sharp. The dizziness. The weakness. She imagined herself giving it away and standing there empty, surrounded by noise and motion with nothing left. Around them, the market held its breath without realizing it. She hesitated, because this meal was the only thing standing between her and collapsing. And what she didn't know was that this man was watching her for a reason. The young salesgirl had learned early that the world did not slow down for grief. By the time she was old enough to understand loss, both her parents were already gone, taken by illness and time before they could leave behind anything except responsibility. Since then, her life had been measured not in years, but in needs. School fees, rent, medicine, food. If she stopped moving, everything collapsed. At home, she shared a single room with 2 younger siblings and a sick aunt whose cough grew worse at night. The walls were thin, the mattress thinner. Privacy didn't exist, and silence was rare. Each morning, before the sun fully rose, she left quietly so she wouldn't wake them. She carried the weight of being the oldest, the strongest by default, even when she felt anything but strong. Her income came from commission. No sales meant no pay. Some days she returned home with coins that barely covered bread. Other days, she returned with nothing at all. There was no salary waiting at the end of the month. No safety net. Only effort and the hope that someone would stop at her stall instead of the next one. Despite this, her dreams were modest. She didn't imagine luxury or escape. She dreamed of stability, regular meals, school uniforms paid on time, a door that locked properly, a life where tomorrow didn't feel like a threat. To her, that was success. In the market, she was known as the quiet one, honest to a fault. If a customer overpaid, she corrected them. If a mistake was made, she owned it, even when it cost her a sale. Her voice was soft, easily drowned out by louder traders who knew how to push and persuade. Because of this, she was often overlooked, sometimes ignored, sometimes taken advantage of. But she never complained. Kindness, she believed, was the only thing she truly owned. When you had nothing else, no money, no connections, no protection, you guarded your character like a final possession. Even when the world taught her that kindness was expensive, she held on to it anyway. The beggar was part of that world too. Everyone in the market knew him, not by name, but by presence. The crippled man with the twisted leg and worn crutches. He appeared and disappeared like a shadow between stalls, lingering too long for comfort, asking too quietly to be heard. Shop owners mocked him when they thought no one was listening. Some chased him away with harsh words or sudden movements. Security guards occasionally forced him out, only for him to return days later, slower but still standing. To most people, he wasn't a person. He was a problem, a distraction, a reminder of something they feared becoming. No one asked where he slept. No one wondered how he survived. They saw only what made them uncomfortable and turned away. And yet, in a world where everyone protected what little they had, one question hovered silently between a hungry salesgirl and a forgotten beggar. What happens when someone gives anyway? Her eyes drifted back to the food. It sat there quietly on the wooden table, wrapped and waiting, as if it understood its importance. She could almost feel its warmth through the thin covering. Simple food, nothing special. Yet at that moment, it felt heavier than money, heavier than pride. It was security. It was strength. It was the one thing keeping her upright. Her stomach tightened again, a deep, hollow ache that reminded her of the night before. She had gone to bed early, not because she was tired, but because sleep was easier than hunger. She remembered lying still on the mattress, listening to her siblings breathe, counting the cracks in the ceiling to distract herself. Each time her stomach growled, she pressed her arm against it and whispered, "Tomorrow." Now tomorrow was here. Customers passed in front of her stall without slowing. Some glanced at her goods, then moved on to louder sellers. Others didn't even look. The sun climbed higher, and the air grew thicker. Sweat formed at the base of her neck. Still, no sales. No coins clinked into her hand. No reason to unwrap the food just yet. She swallowed. The beggar stood where he was, a short distance away. He hadn't moved closer. He hadn't lifted his hand again. He hadn't repeated his request. He simply waited, leaning slightly on his worn crutches, eyes lowered, not in shame, but in patience. It was as if he had already accepted whatever answer would come. That silence made it harder. If he had begged loudly, if he had pleaded or complained, it would have been easier to refuse. She could have told herself he was rude, demanding, unreasonable, but he did none of those things. He stood quietly, giving her space to decide. Her fingers hovered over the food. She remembered the last time she had ignored her hunger for someone else, giving her portion to her youngest sibling when there wasn't enough to go around. She remembered the light in the child's eyes and the way her own dizziness had followed her all day after. Kindness always cost something. She knew that. She just never knew how much it would cost until after. She picked up the food slowly. Her hands moved on instinct, breaking it in half. The motion was familiar, practiced. Half for him, half for her. A compromise, a way to be kind without being reckless. She held the two portions apart, weighing them in her palms. This, she thought, is reasonable. Then she looked at him again. He wasn't watching the food. He wasn't watching her hands. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as though he had learned not to hope too much. As though disappointment had trained him to look past what he wanted. Something in her chest tightened. She thought of how 2 days without food would feel in his body. Not hunger the way she knew it, temporary, manageable, but hunger that hollowed you out completely. Hunger that made your limbs weak, your thoughts slow. Hunger that stole your dignity before it stole your strength. Her fingers curled. She stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she placed one half back against the other, pressing them together as if undoing the decision she had just made. The market noise swelled around them again. Voices, laughter, bargaining. But inside her, everything went quiet. She stepped forward and pushed the entire meal toward him. "Eat," she said softly. "I'll manage." For a moment, nothing happened. Nearby traders noticed. One woman paused mid-sentence and stared. A man behind the stall shook his head slowly, disbelief etched across his face. Another leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, not quite under his breath, "She's foolish." Someone else scoffed. A few people laughed quietly, the sound sharp and dismissive. The beggar looked down at the food. Then he looked up at her. His hands trembled as he reached out, not from weakness alone, but from surprise. He hesitated, as if afraid the offer might disappear if he moved too quickly. When his fingers finally closed around the food, his grip was gentle, almost reverent. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely holding steady. There was no rush, no greed. He lowered himself carefully onto a low crate beside the stall, adjusting his crutches with slow, practiced movements. Before eating, he bowed his head slightly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the moment. Then he began to eat, slowly, respectfully, small bites, chewing carefully, as though every mouthful mattered, as though the food deserved attention, not desperation. Watching him, it became clear that this wasn't the first time hunger had taught him patience. She stepped back behind her stall, her hands suddenly empty. The ache in her stomach sharpened, but she didn't flinch. She focused on arranging her goods again, straightening what was already straight. The work gave her something to hold on to, something to keep her steady. People continued to watch, some with pity, some with judgment, some with curiosity. No one stepped forward to help. No one offered another meal. The market absorbed the moment and moved on, as it always did. Transactions resumed. Voices rose and fell. Life continued. The beggar finished eating and carefully wrapped the empty covering before handing it back to her, as if returning something valuable. "May you never lack," he said quietly. She nodded, unsure what to say. As he moved away on his crutches, disappearing into the flow of people, she stood alone behind her stall, hungry, lightheaded, and strangely calm. She didn't know it yet, but that single choice, the one no one applauded, the one that cost her the most, had already changed the direction of her life. Not because she gave, but because she gave when it hurt. The days that followed did not bring miracles. No sudden rush of customers. No unexpected generosity from the market. Life returned to its usual rhythm, hard, loud, and indifferent. If anything, the salesgirl felt the weight of her choice more sharply. Hunger lingered longer. Fatigue settled deeper into her bones. Yet each morning, she still arrived early, unlocked her stall, and arranged her goods with the same quiet care. On the third day, she noticed him again. The crippled beggar did not approach her this time. He stopped several steps away, leaning against his crutches, watching the flow of customers pass her stall. He said nothing. He asked for nothing. If she hadn't been paying attention, she might have thought he was simply resting. But she felt his presence. When their eyes met, he nodded once, polite, restrained, and turned his gaze back to the market. Only later, when business slowed, did he move closer. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. It was an ordinary question, The kind people asked when they were bored or curious. Still, she answered honestly. 3 years. And before that? I helped my aunt sell vegetables, she said. Before she got sick. He listened without interruption. No pity in his eyes. No probing. Just attention. After a moment, he thanked her and moved on, disappearing between the stalls. This became a pattern. He returned the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes he asked about her siblings. Sometimes about the market. Sometimes about nothing important at all. His questions were simple, almost casual, but his listening was intense, as if he was weighing not just her words, but how she carried them. The first test came quietly. One afternoon, as she bent to rearrange her goods, she heard the soft clink of something hitting the wooden table. When she looked up, she saw a folded note near the edge of her stall. The beggar was already moving away, slow but deliberate. "Sir," she called out. He stopped. "You dropped this." She picked up the money and held it out to him. He stared at it for a moment, then at her face. "That was meant to be for you," he said calmly. She shook her head. "If it was meant for me, you would have given it." A few nearby traders glanced over, curious. The beggar studied her for a second longer, then took the money back without argument. "Thank you," he said again. Another day, a customer hurried through a purchase, clearly distracted. When the man walked away, she counted the money and froze. It was more than the price she had stated. She hesitated. No one was watching closely. The customer was already several steps away. That extra money could mean food, transport, medicine, something necessary. She called after him anyway. "Sir, you paid too much." He turned, surprised, and accepted the change with a nod of gratitude before disappearing into the crowd. The beggar, who had been standing nearby, saw everything. He said nothing. The third test was louder. A neighboring vendor, irritated by the beggar's presence, snapped one morning, "Why are you still here?" The man barked, "Go somewhere else. You're bad for business." The beggar lowered his eyes, shifting his weight uncomfortably. Before she could think, the salesgirl spoke. "He's not bothering anyone," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "He's just standing," the vendor scoffed. "Standing? Look at him. Customers don't like seeing this." "He's a person," she replied. Not a curse. The market went quiet for a heartbeat. Then laughter broke out from a few stalls. The vendor shook his head and turned away, muttering insults under his breath. The beggar looked at her then, not with gratitude, but with something deeper, something thoughtful. It didn't go unnoticed. Whispers began to spread. Traders complained that her stall was becoming a gathering point, that the beggar's presence made customers uncomfortable, that she was encouraging dependency. "She's distracting customers," one woman said loudly. "You give once, and they never leave," another added. Sales were already slow. Now they slowed further. Security guards started paying attention. One afternoon, 2 men in faded uniforms approached her stall. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't cause a scene. Their tone was almost polite, which made it more dangerous. "We've had complaints," one of them said. "About the beggar?" She nodded. "He doesn't cause trouble. That's not the issue," the other guard replied. "If you keep this up, you'll lose your spot." Her heart dropped. This stall was everything. Without it, there was no income. No way to pay rent. No way to survive. She thought of her siblings. Her aunt. The fragile balance she worked so hard to maintain. "I understand," she said quietly. The guards lingered for a moment, as if expecting resistance. When none came, they moved on. The beggar had watched the entire exchange. Later, when the market thinned, he approached her again. "You could have stayed silent," he said. "It would have been easier." She shrugged slightly. "Maybe, but it wouldn't have been right." He nodded, as if confirming something only he could see. As he turned away, she felt the weight of what she had chosen settle fully on her shoulders. Kindness was no longer just personal. It had consequences now. Real ones. Still, the next morning, she opened her stall as usual. And somewhere in the market, unseen and unannounced, the test continued. The accusation came without warning. It was late morning when the shouting began sharp, sudden, cutting through the market's usual noise like a blade. A woman stood a few stalls away, holding up a piece of cloth, her face twisted with outrage. "She took it," the woman yelled, pointing. "She stole from me." Heads turned instantly. Conversation stopped. Eyes followed the direction of the finger until they landed on the salesgirl. She froze. "I didn't," she said, her voice barely rising above the noise. "I didn't take anything." The woman pushed forward, anger feeding her confidence. "I saw you." "Don't lie." The salesgirl's heart hammered. She shook her head again, helplessly, but her words seemed to disappear before they reached anyone. People loved a spectacle, and in the market, truth often mattered less than volume. Security arrived quickly this time. They didn't ask questions. They didn't search carefully. They glanced at the goods on the table, exchanged looks, and made a decision that was already forming in their minds. "You'll close your stall for today," one guard said. "We'll sort this out later." "I didn't steal," she whispered, but her protest sounded small even to herself. Her goods were pushed aside, her table cleared. The accusation lingered in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. As she packed what she was allowed to take, she felt eyes on her, some curious, some satisfied, some almost relieved that the trouble had landed on someone else. She walked away with nothing in her hands. The sun felt harsher outside the market. Each step home grew heavier. Hunger gnawed at her again, sharper now because it carried shame with it. When she reached the room she shared with her family, she sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the floor. There was nothing to bring home. That thought hurt more than the hunger. That night, when everyone else slept, she finally let herself break. Not loudly, no wailing, no drama. She turned her face into the pillow and cried silently, shoulders shaking as she tried not to make a sound. Her tears soaked the fabric, hot and unstoppable. Was this what kindness brought? She replayed the days in her mind. The food she gave away, the risks she took, the way she defended someone everyone else avoided. None of it had helped her. None of it had protected her. If anything, it had painted a target on her back. Maybe they were right, she thought. Maybe kindness was foolish. Maybe survival meant closing your eyes and minding your own business. The thought felt heavy, but it also felt tempting. Tomorrow, she decided, things would be different. Tomorrow she would say nothing, see nothing, give nothing. She would protect what little she had and stop trying to be more than the world required. "Tomorrow, I'll mind my own business," she whispered into the darkness. Sleep came late and shallow. Morning arrived too quickly. She dressed and left as usual, though something inside her felt hollow. The market was already buzzing when she arrived, but her stall was different. The lock was still on. Not her lock. A thick metal chain wrapped around the wooden posts, sealing the space where her table should have been. Her heart skipped. She looked around, confused. Maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe someone would explain. Then she saw it. Her goods were gone. Not rearranged. Not covered. Gone. A guard stood nearby, arms crossed, avoiding her eyes. "Where are my things?" she asked. "They've been taken for investigation," he replied flatly. "For how long?" he shrugged. "Depends." The words landed with finality. The market noise surged around her again. Buyers, sellers, laughter, but it felt distant, unreal. She stood there, staring at the locked stall, her mind struggling to catch up with reality. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was loss. She leaned against the post to steady herself, her legs suddenly weak. No tears came this time. No anger. No fear. Just emptiness. a quiet collapse that happened entirely inside her chest. People walked past her without stopping. The beggar was nowhere in sight. For the first time since this began, she was truly alone, without food, without income, without even the small space she had carved out in the world. And as she stood there, numb and silent, the question she had tried to avoid pressed heavily against her heart. Had kindness cost her everything? She didn't know the answer yet. But somewhere beyond the noise of the market, something was already moving toward her, unseen, unstoppable, and far bigger than she could imagine. The market was louder than usual that morning. Word had spread quickly something was happening. People gathered in small clusters, whispering, pointing toward the open space near the security post. Traders abandoned their stalls for a few minutes at a time, curiosity pulling them forward. Even the guards stood straighter, alert in a way they usually weren't. The salesgirl stood near her locked stall, still empty inside. She hadn't moved much since arriving. There was nothing to arrange, nothing to sell, only questions with no answers. Then the sound came, low, controlled, unmistakable. Engines. The market quieted, not suddenly, but gradually, as people noticed the line of black SUVs rolling slowly toward the entrance. Polished, expensive, completely out of place among dust, wooden stalls, and shouting vendors. The vehicle stopped. Doors opened. Men stepped out well-dressed, composed, scanning the area with practiced eyes. Their shoes didn't touch the ground carelessly. Their movements were deliberate. This wasn't a visit. It was an arrival. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Who are they? Government? Police? No one had answers. One of the men spoke quietly into a device at his ear. Another nodded and gestured. Security guards who moments ago had felt powerful now shifted uneasily, unsure whether to intervene or step back. The salesgirl watched, confusion tightening her chest. None of this made sense. It had nothing to do with her, or so she thought. Then the crowd parted. A familiar figure emerged between the SUVs. At first, people didn't recognize him. He was clean. His clothes were simple but well-fitted. His posture was different, straighter, steadier. He still walked with a limp, but his movements were confident now, controlled, not apologetic. Security flanked him. Someone gasped. Another whispered a name they weren't sure of. The salesgirl felt her breath catch. She knew those eyes. She knew that face. The beggar. The same man who had stood quietly by her stall. The same voice that had asked for food. The same eyes that had watched, listened, and remembered everything. The market froze. He stopped near the center of the crowd and looked around slowly. His gaze passed over the stalls, the traders, the guards. He saw the whispers, the fear, the confusion. Then his eyes found her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Recognition washed over her in wave shock, disbelief, and something close to fear. Her heart pounded as the past days rearranged themselves in her mind, each moment suddenly sharp and clear. He stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was calm, familiar, the same voice she had heard when he thanked her for food. Only now, it carried authority, quiet, undeniable. "I came here," he said, "to see who people are when no one is watching." The words landed heavily. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Traders exchanged looks. Some stared at the ground. Others stared at him, mouths open, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they knew. He continued, unhurried. "I was mocked here, ignored here, chased away." His eyes moved briefly toward the guards. "And yet, I stayed." People shifted uncomfortably. "Because sometimes," he said, "the truth only appears when power is stripped away." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the salesgirl's locked stall. "She gave when it cost her," he said. "She spoke when silence would have protected her. She chose integrity when no reward was promised." Silence fell. The crowd followed his gaze to her. She felt suddenly exposed. Too many eyes. Too much attention. She wanted to disappear, but she couldn't look away. The man took another step forward. "My name doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is what I saw." A well-dressed man beside him nodded and held out a document to the nearest guard. The guard glanced at it, and his face drained of color. Whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs into stunned silence. The beggar, the man they had dismissed, had never been powerless. He had been watching, testing, remembering, and in that moment, the market understood something it had never prepared for. The person they overlooked held all the power, and the person they underestimated had already passed the test. The silence that followed his words was heavy, thick enough to feel. People stood frozen, caught between disbelief and fear. The market, usually alive with noise and motion, felt suddenly small, as if every stall, every voice, every decision made in this place had been quietly recorded and replayed. The man who had once been a beggar raised his chin slightly. "I am not here for spectacle," he said, "and I am not here for praise." One of the well-dressed men beside him stepped forward and addressed the crowd, his voice clear and professional. "The man standing before you is a private philanthropist," he said, "a businessman whose companies operate across borders. He does not announce his wealth. He does not seek recognition." A ripple moved through the people. The former beggar continued, calmly filling in the spaces their minds raced to occupy. "Years ago, I lost my leg," he said, "not to illness, not to fate, to violence. And with it, I lost something else, my trust in how people treat those who appear weak." His words were measured, without bitterness. "So I began to walk unseen." He explained how, in different cities, in different countries, he stripped away his name, his resources, his protection. He became invisible by choice, dressed in rags, moving slowly, asking quietly, not to beg for money, but to observe humanity in its rawest form. "How people act," he said, "when they believe there will be no consequence." Some in the crowd looked away. "I have been chased from markets like this," he continued. "Mocked, spat on, treated as if I were less than human. And sometimes I found what I expected." His gaze returned to the salesgirl. "And sometimes," he said, "I found something rare." He turned fully toward her now. "She gave when it hurt," he said. "Not from abundance, but from lack. She defended dignity, not appearances. And she never once asked me who I was or what I could offer her in return." He paused, letting the truth settle. "That is why she stands here." A man from security stepped forward nervously. "Sir," he began, "about the theft accusation." "It was false," the philanthropist said calmly. "And it was convenient." He gestured again. Another document was handed over. The guards exchanged looks, suddenly unsure of their footing. Her name was cleared publicly. Apologies were offered, not loudly, not sincerely, but enough to be heard. The chain was removed from her stall. Not only that, the wooden posts were replaced. A larger space was opened, better materials, a location closer to the market center. Someone began to clap, then stopped, unsure if it was appropriate. The man raised his hand slightly. "There will be an education fund," he said, "for her siblings, for training, for choice. Choice." The word echoed. "And a position," he added, "if she wants it. No obligation, no debt. She chooses." All eyes turned to her. She stood still, absorbing the weight of what was being offered. Money, security, escape, everything she had never dared to imagine. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't fall to her knees. She took a breath. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. "But please, help others too." The market went silent. No applause, no cheers. Just the quiet realization that this moment was bigger than generosity or reward. It was about who people were when no one was watching. and who they became when the truth finally stood before them. And in that silence, the salesgirl proved once more that kindness had never been her weakness. It had been her power all along. The days that followed did not transform her life overnight. There were no fireworks, no sudden mansion, no instant escape from struggle. Instead, change arrived quietly like morning light creeping through a cracked window. Slow, steady, real. Her stall reopened in its new space, stronger and better built, but still familiar. She still woke before dawn, still arranged her goods with care, still spoke softly to customers. The difference was not in who she became, but in what she no longer had to fear. The education fund meant her siblings stayed in school. Uniforms were paid for on time. Books replaced worry. At home, medicine came regularly for her aunt. Nights were no longer filled with whispered calculations about what could be skipped next. Yet, she did not stop living simply. She did not dress to announce success. She did not raise her voice. She did not treat anyone differently, not the guards, not the traders who once mocked her, not the beggars others still avoided. When asked why she hadn't changed, she would only smile and say, "I have what I need," and it was true. What changed most was not her income, but her certainty. She no longer doubted that kindness had value. She no longer wondered if decency was foolish. The question had been answered, not with words, but with consequences. The man who had tested the market did not remain. He never stayed long in one place. His work was quiet, deliberate, and unseen by design. Before he left, he returned once more, not with security, not with attention. Just a brief visit. "You passed a test you didn't know you were taking," he told her. She shook her head gently. "I wasn't trying to pass anything." He smiled then, not approving, not proud, just understanding. That was the point. Because the truth is this: tests rarely announce themselves. They don't come with warnings or labels. They don't arrive when we are ready, rested, or secure. They appear when we are tired, hungry, afraid, when giving costs something real. Wealth doesn't always dress loudly. Power doesn't always arrive with noise. And goodness is almost never convenient. In that market, surrounded by people protecting what little they had, one young woman made a choice that looked small, ordinary, almost invisible. But small acts, done honestly, carry weight. The smallest act can echo the loudest. Most people believe kindness is a response to gratitude, to reward, to recognition. But real kindness is something else entirely. It exists without witnesses, without guarantees, without promises. Some people don't test your kindness because they need help. They test it because the world has lost faith. Lost faith that anyone will give without taking. Lost faith that dignity matters more than advantage. Lost faith that character exists when no one is counting. And when that faith is broken too many times, people stop expecting goodness altogether. That is why moments like this matter. Not because a billionaire revealed himself. Not because justice arrived dramatically. But because, long before any reward, someone chose to act as if goodness still mattered. She didn't know she was being watched. She didn't know her choice would be seen. She only knew someone was hungry, and she was holding food. And that is where every real moral decision lives. Not in comfort, not in safety, but in the space between fear and compassion. So as the market returned to its noise, as stories spread and faded, one truth remained quiet, unshakable, and uncomfortable in the best way. Kindness is never wasted, even when it costs you, even when it hurts, even when no one thanks you, because you never know who is watching, and you never know what kind of world your smallest act is helping rebuild. So here's the question that lingers long after the story ends, meant not to accuse, but to reflect. If kindness cost you your last meal, would you still give?